Hello everybody. This is Positive Hug delivered by myself, Beata Young. Eithne Treanor, just bear with me a second. I need to switch off some devices before we go live. And it's a pleasure to welcome today Eithne Treanor, who's joined me from Dubai today. Eithne is established journalist. She's been featured in many televisions. I actually made note just not to miss the many ABC News, Sky News, BBC World, CNBC Europe. The numbers are enormous. Eithne, you're in Dubai at the moment. What's the weather like today?
Well, we've had a very rainy day, so it's lovely to be joining you because I hear the weather in Europe is absolutely beautiful right now. But yeah, it's been dull and gray and overcast, and it's been rainy in Dubai. But you know what? That's okay too. It clears the air. And it's been one of those days where, you know, we're all under lockdown, but this was one where we maybe took an extra special lockdown and thought, nah, you don't have to do anything today. It's raining out there.
Fantastic. We are also not so much enjoying the lockdown, but definitely enjoying delivering positive thinking. And today's mission is, Eithne, and I am sure you're going to be brilliant because you've been coined a positive thinker and a very positive person by many people. And so the question is, how do you keep positivity, especially in this time of turmoil?
I think there's, you know, positivity, obviously it's your mental, you know, space, it's your mental condition, it's what you have to sort of look at. And I suppose I've always had a sense of being positive, even in the face of great adversity. And I think it's something that you learn early in your childhood and you carry that throughout your career, and you have to carry it through, you know, particularly when you work on your own. I run my own business and there's not a whole lot of other people, the buck stops here. So you have to have tremendous resilience. And I think it's something you just continuously work on, and you look at your situation and perhaps look at the situation around you and realize just how privileged you are and just how special, you know, in many ways you are, because things are going hopefully a bit better for you than they are for a lot of people. And right now, as we look around the world today, I think, you know, those of us who have our health and who are busy, who have something to do, and we always have something to do. Somebody once said, are you not getting a bit bored? I could never get bored. I have a long list of things that I have to do. So there's no excuse. And even though I allow that list to get longer every now and then, there's plenty that I can put in place to almost inspire myself, because ultimately that's what we all have to do. And especially at a time like this.
Fantastic, Eithne. I think it goes in the Irish veins, I have to say, because having an Irish husband, I definitely can testify to that it's definitely something you are trying to make up for the bad weather in Ireland. So now the question is, because at the moment you are the founder of ET Media company, so you started your company not so long ago, and your path wasn't that clear from the beginning, right? Because I think it's actually, you reminded me story of Oprah Winfrey, who said, I discovered what I want to do by doing many things that I didn't want to do. Is that the same case in your scenario?
Well, probably for a very small time, very small time. I've been absolutely privileged and so lucky that I've done always what I wanted to do. And when I look back on my career, I wanted to be a lawyer or a politician. And I'm so glad I became neither of them. I think becoming a lawyer would have been way too difficult for me in terms of really grasping hold of the tremendous detail that one needs to be on top of at all times. Being a politician, and I ran for college politics once when I was in university, and you realize that half the people are going to hate you most of the time. And that's the issue with partisan politics. And I think we see that around the world, as one party or the other. So that wouldn't have suited me. And becoming a journalist, I couldn't have wished for anything better. I spent a lot of time actually working behind the scenes as a producer as an assignment desk coordinator, all of that, but I really wanted to become a reporter, and that I got the opportunity to do. And now what I do is I'm a media consultant, a media trainer, and I'm also a professional conference moderator. So I've taken all of my journalist skills and actually flipped them around into the corporate world. And I'm doing everything, I suppose, that I did as a journalist, without probably getting some of the abuse that might come with it, or people that didn't want to answer questions or didn't really want to talk to you. So I don't have as much pushback, I guess, as that. But it took me probably just a little while to make that transition. But once I did, you know, I've been on a clear path since, and it's been very adventurous, and it's been great fun.
It's actually very telling, because your background is a world map, and I've heard that you've been traveling in many places, and you've had experience in many different jurisdictions, and you talked to many politicians, leaders. So what really made you so confident, and how do you cope with fear? Because I'm not sure, but for me, even though I'm not doing it as a job, for me, preparing for the topic and preparing for the interview, or making sure that the panelists are evenly, the time is spread, it takes a lot of effort. How was it for you? Do you still feel the fear when you have to prepare for a conference or you moderate a panel?
It takes a lot of effort, without a doubt, to pull together a successful panel. And the way I approach it, actually, I always sort of put myself in a position whereby, as I say, I'm the conductor. I'm like an orchestra conductor. And what I have in place are, you know, tremendous talent that are going to give me the information that I need to then bring it out to the audience, because ultimately that's why we're all there. So when you're pulling a panel discussion together, or any kind of an interview, it's not so much the one-on-one engagement, it's actually delivering this out to the audience. And why is that person talking to the audience? What value will that person bring? So these are the things that I work on in advance. And I always make a point of engaging with my panel members in advance to say to them, what are the absolute essential points that you really want to talk about, that you're very passionate to talk about, and that you really, really feel must be brought across. Now, when I have that information from my panelists, then I'm a lot more secure, and I can then almost start to pull together almost like the broken jigsaw and think, okay, he wants to talk about that, she wants to talk about this, that, this. And then in my moderator orchestra type position, I pull it all together. And as I say, when we get it working and one follows up on the other, because I have a little bit of insight before I start, that's when the magic happens. That's when the harmony comes together. And that's when your audience really begins to see a thread within that panel and great stories coming out of that panel. And they really begin to get involved and really enjoy the discussion. And that's ultimately why you're there. My role as a moderator, and even my role when I was a reporter, is to make the person I'm talking to and talking with look great, and perform great.
That's a very good explanation. I have to, as a violin player, ex-violin player, had no ambition. I have to say that it's the most difficult part for me is how to make sure that this soloist is not overtaking the discussion. How do you cope with that?
Again, that's where the preparation in advance really works to your advantage. And if you can, and we will all find sometimes that there is somebody that wants to say more. But if you go into that blind and you don't know that in advance, then it's difficult to control. But when you know that in advance and you understand where that person, where their strengths are, you can actually play to that, make sure they get to say what they want to say, but then balance it out because you know what to expect from somebody else and someone else might not agree. So again, it's that role as a moderator, it's that role as really the leader of that group, to take charge of that and to see the different personalities, to make sure every one of them has something to say, to make sure that their point of view is heard and that is valued, and that actually you can bring it in sync, I suppose, with what the other people are saying. So it takes a bit of practice. I mean, and ultimately, I get a lot more practice than other people have got. So hopefully I've got a lot better with it over the years.
You're fantastic. I have to say that I watched your videos with pleasure. So just as an insight for our audience, you post your videos online on your YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn channel. So I hope our viewers are going to rush to see. But before you rush to see, you're more than welcome, dear viewers, to post questions in Facebook or on YouTube, and we will be happy to answer. And now I've got a question about what do you remember some mistakes that you made, even silly, because it's about, you know, we've got this concept of everybody is a finished product and you just appear on this television on a big screen and everything is perfect. But actually, just instead of comedy, for the last couple of nights we were watching news bloopers, and that was a great entertaining time, better than any comedy. How do you do that? And what mistakes did you make?
It doesn't always go, you know, totally smooth. I mean, I've done an interview, and over the years, of course, you build up good relationships with the people you're going to interview. One hopes you do. But I remember once doing an interview with the CEO, and by the time we got back to the channel, we realized we had no sound. I mean, there was no sound. The cameraman had completely forgotten to, you know, put on the sound. And of course, every cameraman should be wearing headphones while they're listening to make sure the sound balance was, he was a new young cameraman. And to this day, we still have a bit of a joke about that one. And thankfully, we knew the CEO well enough that we could call back and say, really, really sorry on this. Can we just come back and do it again? So that was a bit embarrassing. And but these things happen too. And once I was introducing a footballer from South Africa who had done some work with a very big football club in London. And I wanted to make that, or not in London, in the UK. I wanted to make the sort of the visual link from, I mean, he was literally picked up on the streets, the back streets of, you know, South Africa, in Johannesburg or somewhere. So he was a poor kid kicking a ball. So I wanted to kind of make the link from, here he is from the streets of, you know, or from Johannesburg streets to which I said, to Manchester City, which was where the city where he ended up being. But of course, he played for Manchester United. So while I was just trying to put the town and the city concept, I made such a mess of it, because obviously there's Manchester United and Manchester City, and he certainly didn't play for Manchester City, even though he came to the city. So that was very funny. But probably I think my biggest screw up of all, and I learned a big lesson on this one. I was doing some work with the European stock exchanges, and I worked in Amsterdam for a while, and I had gotten to know the CEO very well. And there was talk that they were going to go to London and they were looking at a big merger. And I was working with CNBC at the time. And I met them early in the morning, which was rather surprising that they were at the stock exchange so early. And his head of sales was with him. And I had said hello to George, and he was all chat and sort of, you know, the Dutch give you 3 kisses and it's nice. I hadn't met his head of sales before. So jokingly, I said to his head of sales, I said, so when are you and George off to London to do the big deal? And he said, we're heading there now. To which I just looked and said, yeah, right, in your dreams. And I said, well, have a good flight. And it just went right over my head. And then probably about 3 or 4 hours later, the news desk in London called me and said, what on earth is going on here? Why, you know, are the Dutch in London possibly looking at this deal? To which then I realized I had missed like the mega story, even though I had had it. I was given it. I was almost gifted it. And I was like, yeah, right, you're going to London to do the deal.
So how did you manage to go out of it? Like, how did you cope with this failure?
Well, there was nothing I could have done. It was too late. You know, I didn't admit to everybody that I had talked to them in the morning and they almost told me. But also, you have to remember, I think, as a journalist, you know, it's not always just about getting the big story. Had I broken that story, because it was given to me, I suppose, by mistake in many ways, and it wasn't given to me intentionally, which great, you know, journalists like to get stuff like that sometimes. But if I had broken the story then, it would have broken down all the trust that was already there. We were in the stock exchange in Amsterdam. We were working very closely with the CEO at that time, and all of that trust would have been gone. And I'm not sure they would have allowed us to stay reporting out of the stock exchange. So in many ways, sometimes there's things perhaps you choose not to do, and that's fine. It would have been nice to get a leg up on everybody else and know that in advance, but you know, at the end of the day, it didn't really matter that much, and they didn't do the deal. It wasn't happening. Everybody knew they might do it and they might think about it, and of course one day it all happened. You know, so sometimes you have to kind of choose what you do there. So in many ways, I was glad it ended up as it did, but it did teach me to really listen to what people say, because sometimes they actually give you the answer when you're not expecting it.
I actually have got here Patrick asking us a very related question. What have been your most difficult interview or conference panel? There you go.
Okay, this is really funny. I think it has to be Lord Archer. Many of you will be familiar with Jeffrey Archer, the writer, and you know, he was a British politician. And I did an interview with him once. And there were two of us doing this interview. It was very funny. And the other lady introduced him as Lord Jeffrey Archer. He quickly said, you call me Lord Archer or you call me Jeffrey Archer, but you do not call me Lord Jeffrey Archer. So we're like, okay, we're off to a good start on this. And we were talking about, it was at the Dubai Literary Festival. And I said to him, you know, so what do you say to people who want to become a writer? Because he has written so many books. I've lost track. I mean, there's hundreds of them out there. He just turns them out. So I said to him, you know, what do you say to people who want to write books? And his immediate response was, well, he said, I meet people all the time that say to me, oh, there's a book in them. And I say, well, thank God, that's where it ought to stay. So we're going, okay, we're going nowhere with this. And then he started talking about what a great writer he was, and how he can just write them. He said, you're either born a writer or you're not born a writer. And I was getting nowhere with this interview. It was really tough. And then he said, well, I couldn't be a violinist. I'm a writer. This is what I do. I'm so good at it. I just write every day. It's like this. I couldn't be a ballerina. I couldn't be he said, a violinist or an opera singer or something. And I said, yeah, I guess so. I said, I couldn't be a ballerina or something like that. To which he looked at me and goes, well, that's for sure. There was no win on this interview. I mean, it just kept going down a hole. It was pretty bad. But thankfully, I haven't really had too many bad ones. It's tough when you get somebody who doesn't speak English as a first language and who maybe cannot understand. So you just, you know, make it as clear as possible and give them just a straightforward question, a really simple question. And all you've got to do is just take their answer. And even sometimes if you can't hear it, you just acknowledge it and move to somebody else. It's part of, I think, what you learn to do.
So since we are focused on technology, and maybe you could share some insight, because you've been in TV business for so many years. What do you think modern television will look like in a couple of years' time? Is it going to be digital? Is it going to be Facebook TV? What is your prediction on that?
It's already moving in that direction, I think. And when we look at the concept of television as we know it, and we look back, it was very much, you know, a smaller, privileged group of people deciding editorial content for the masses. Now, this has completely changed. And people who became television stars, who were television reporters, who were chosen to do that job, you know, went through a pretty tough position in terms of being chosen to do it. I mean, it wasn't that easy. And there were loads of people that were never, ever going to get on television. Whereby now we look at the internet and we look at all of the platforms that are out there. And in many ways, we're looking at the democratization of journalism in a way. And again, I'd be careful not to necessarily call it journalism, the democratization of information, perhaps, because anybody can deliver you information. And at times, you know, we have to listen to President Donald Trump when he talks about fake news, because there's plenty of it out there. You know, it's not justifying everything he says, but it's certainly changing a lot. But it is also creating, I think, wonderful presenters, and it's creating people who have great talent. And it's also creating very, very interesting people that have proven themselves that they can be part of the mix. And they often move on to international television. But I think it's how we're viewing television. You know, they called it broadcast, which was, here we are, this is what we've got, we're giving it to everybody. But now I think we're beginning to see kind of that concept, and we've seen it over 20 years or more, the concept of narrowcast. People want to see specific content. This financial television, I think, was the first one that ever really did that, in terms of going, this is for a specific audience, and this is what we do, and we do it well, and we have a great audience. So it's changing a lot, and I think it'll continue to change, but I don't think the big television news as we know it is going to go away. And I think particularly during this crisis, while people receive their news by different means, they might not sit in front of a television and look at it. They'll look at a screen, they look on their computer, but the actual broadcast news networks, as we know, I think their viewing has gone up tremendously because people trust these sources and they want to see the big briefings, and that's where people go. And when you think back, you know, Facebook had a bit of a problem, you know, a couple of years ago, and where did Mark Zuckerberg go to make that big apology? He went on CNN. So there's still a lot to be said for the big networks out there, and people still rely on them, and people still want to make sure that they have the credibility of being seen there.
But we've seen this concept, and you actually talk about it in one of your videos, because there are so many creators, and this is actually, we create this community for not users of technology, no longer only users, but also creators of technology, because it's so easy to now start live stream from your mobile phone and do a little bit of YouTube video. And actually, kids are now talking about their prospective career as, I would like to be YouTuber. So there is so many people who create a content in the hope that there will be somebody who will want to watch it. And what is your golden tip, how to captivate your audience?
Without a doubt, there's so many great people out there that are presenting and that are, you know, getting a great audience. I mean, you have to look at, you know, the beauty market. Who would have thought? And they're probably the biggest influencers and beauty tips that have come from girls of all ages, not just girls, you know, teenagers, boys and girls, men and women, older women, younger women, everything. I mean, that created an unbelievable following. And if anybody had suggested years ago, let's make a television channel that did that, I'm sure they would have been, you know, outvoted. Maybe somebody thought of it years ago, but it wasn't going to happen. But it happens on the mobile phone, and it happens incredibly well. And people are getting very creative, and they're also getting technically creative and technically informed in terms of how they deliver better content. I think if you deliver good content, you need to make sure that you've got, you know, decent lighting. You can't just throw it up there. You have to be ready to do it. And I think we're beginning to see some really, it's beginning to look a lot more polished. I think when it all started, anybody could just get on and do whatever they want and just talk and somebody would listen to them. But I think the more competitive it got, people are really putting a bit more effort into it and making sure that, you know, technically they're looking a little bit better than the other people, doing a bit of fancy editing, and there's some great tools that are out there. So all of this is, you know, they're raising the bar, and that's what competition does. So I think we're seeing much better quality out there than we did, let's say, 10 years ago.
That's interesting, because actually yesterday I was captivated because on Facebook stream, all of a sudden, I don't know why, how these algorithms work, but I watched a video of a previous inmate. She did a tutorial how to do your makeup when you don't have makeup and you've got only a coffee grains and you've got some powder and a little bit of wall. And she did that, even though it didn't look attractive, it didn't look good, and actually you strive for perfection, whereas Wendy Clark talks, the CEO of DDB worldwide, is talking about perfection is no longer the thing. It's about authenticity. And is the authenticity more important than perfection, or is it at the same level? How is it for you?
I think authenticity is what you make it. And if authenticity for me is showing up, which I sincerely hope it does, I'm, going to put a bit of makeup on. I'm going to fix my hair. I'm just going to be in a position where I'm not in my bedroom. I'm not in my kitchen. I don't have the computer looking up at the ceiling. I've just put a little bit of effort into this, not a whole lot. It's not that difficult. I even put a bit of perfume on before I came out. God only knows why. But it's sort of, for me, there's a bit of a buzz to get ready. I have no interest in doing this video in my bedroom. And I've seen quite a lot of bizarre shots on television lately where, people, I've seen their bedroom and I'm like, why on earth would anybody want to see this? We all have a decent enough wall. We've all got a window somewhere. I realize that we might be a little constrained given the fact that everybody is at home, but you've got books to make your computer look a little heavier or a little higher. One of the great things is there's an IKEA plastic riser for your computer, and it's got to be the best thing that has ever been invented. And I think it's less than £5 to buy. And it's not alone is it good for video, but it's also really good for your eye level when you're actually working, because none of us should be looking down at our computers that way. A lot of people are complaining about sore necks during all of this new conversion into, what's going on in the online world, but it's because everyone's looking down here and it's not a natural place for your neck. So it's just put a little bit of thought process into it. And yourself, if you show up at somebody's house and, I take an example of my sister's house in Ireland. There's a lovely china cup, and it's not a fancy one at all. But my sister Marion delivers this cup every time I show up. And it's really nice. And, she might have made, some cake or something special that I like. And I guess, it is actually, it's a lovely feeling that you think, wow, this is nice, rather than show up and she says, oh, we don't have that tea you like, and I didn't have time to make anything, but, good you're here. So in a way, put a little bit of effort into it. I think it pays off. There's nothing non-authentic about it. You're absolutely being passionate and still being authentic about what you do. And that doesn't mean you've got to roll out of bed and show up and say, here I am, this is me, this is what you get. That can be a little bit distracting sometimes.
We've got another question from Fran, but before we delve into questions from our lovely audience, thank you very much for joining us. You actually, in one of your videos, you talked about how bad it looks if a dog runs in front of you or a cat strolls on your desk, and actually you used that video, that famous video of a guy who's giving an interview, and all of a sudden his kid is barging through the door and then it's going away. And you say it's not a good example, but then on the other hand, if you look at what really, how this story went viral and how all of a sudden everybody knew he's an expert in XYZ, maybe that's the way to go viral?
I mean, I got a lot of people give me a hard time about that, but I mean, I have absolutely no interest in watching somebody's cat if I'm there to listen to something else. I mean, that's fine. It serves its purpose. There are times when it can't be helped, but I think what's happening now, people are actually doing it on purpose, just because, you know, they're like going, oh, we're working from home, here was my cat, my dog, my kids, my wife. It's fine, you know, but I think depending on the circumstances, people have had to use Zoom calls to actually lay people off work. Now, if you're on the recipient of that, I wouldn't be really happy if at that point the boss's cat walks in. You know, so there's times, I think, when you can get away with it and when it doesn't particularly matter. But I would say, you know, I think I always say, don't add a distraction. You know, you're there to give a message. You're there to deliver a message. How important do you see that message? How important is your presence there? What value are you adding? So therefore, everything about you showing up. Yes, be authentic. It's fine if you have cats and children and everything else around, but maybe this is not the time to share them. So, you know, people have different opinions on this. Some people love it, they get a great laugh out of it. But again, I would also say there's just maybe it works in some circumstances, and then perhaps in others, maybe just best to leave them out of the picture.
Oh, I can promise you that I'm going to show our lovely viewer today, Fran. She was viewing our PhD last week with her daughter, and apparently the daughter managed to go through the whole cycle, and I promise to have our dog today, especially for her. So now off for Fran's question. What tips do you have for addressing sensitive subjects with panel members to get them to open up and speak directly and frankly rather than scripted or a generic form? That's an interesting one.
What you need to get, particularly on a panel, is, you know, I always say to people, tell me stories, tell me how things work. And if there is a sensitive area, first of all, you've got to establish, is this sensitive subject? Is it a subject for conversation? Sometimes it's not. And I think we have to be very careful about that. People don't necessarily come on a panel to deal with too many sensitive subjects. And I don't think people should ever be embarrassed on a panel. This is not why they're there. They're there to add value on something else. So, you know, I rarely find that, but I do find there are situations. I think it's about talking about it in advance. It's not being scripted and it's not being over generic, but it's about making sure that, you know, you will discuss this, you have to say it, and you do need an answer. So it's giving the person a little bit of time to actually think about what they can say. But I would never put anybody in a position, it's never my job. And I never, ever did it. Even as a journalist, I didn't feel I got a lot out of it. Why would I, you know, totally go and embarrass somebody? It's not what I want to do. Particularly as a conference moderator, it's not on my agenda at all. And I'm not a big fan when it does happen. I think a lot of my former journalist colleagues and who are still journalists use that panel position to actually do an interview with somebody, and that may be very good and it's making headlines for them and they're getting news, but probably that person didn't sign up for that panel to be interrogated about something that maybe they didn't want to talk about. So, you know, I think there's a difference between, are you a journalist or are you a panel moderator? And you can make sure that all of the issues are discussed and they're discussed as honestly as they can be. But, you know, I would be awarding no prizes for embarrassing people and throwing up surprises just because it makes me as a moderator look good. I don't need that.
So I hope you will excuse my question about your failures, and now we can actually talk about we discussed failures, and actually that shows your human side, because nobody's not making mistakes. Everybody's learning from mistakes, which is a much better way. And we tend to not to listen to our mothers and fathers telling us what to do, what to avoid, and we remember these mistakes much better if we've done them ourselves. So now the question is, we are striving towards mentorship, because I'm sure there were some mentors who shaped you the way you are, and maybe you could delve into that topic.
You might be surprised to hear that there were very few mentors in the television business, and particularly at my time when I worked there, and even still today, I think it's a really, really tough business. And when I look at the great opportunities that corporations have for their young people coming into the industry now and for the workforce, it is unbelievable. And they don't believe when I tell them how we worked. I mean, literally, you know, I think to get into, you have to be really tough to want to become a journalist. I think the bigger companies now have, you know, more empathetic HR people on board, and probably more empathetic managers. But when I grew up in this industry, it was really, really tough. We had a boss when I worked in America who, if anything went wrong, would literally come storming out of his office and just kick the bins, the paper dustbins along the way, you know, the waste paper basket. They'd be just like kicked. It's like people would be like head down. It was really weird. There was a female boss that I had once, and I approached her because I was freelancing a lot and I was doing a lot of night shifts. And, you know, night shifts, they're tough after a while unless you kind of want to do them. So I approached her once and I asked her, you know, maybe I could change from the night shift because, you know, I was just doing too many. And I, you know, and she just sort of looked up and she went, "What's the problem? Are we not paying you?" And I was like, "Well, yes, you know, it's fine. But, you know, I'd like to do some day shifts rather than night shifts." And this is the hazard of 24-hour news. But when you're a freelance person way back in the day, it's, you take what you get pretty much. So but I was getting just a few too many night shifts. And you will not believe her response. And to this day, and this was a female boss. I do admit that this is going back maybe 30 years ago or so. And she literally put down her pen and looked up at me and she said, "Eithne, you need to remember," she said, "that being a freelancer is like prostitution." She said, "If I feel like picking you up, I will. And I will do it on my terms and at my time." So she said, "We pay you, okay? You do a good job. It's all even. Thank you." And she went back to her thing. And I'm like, wow. And this was from a woman. So literally, and if there were any complaints being a journalist, you know, literally you were told, you know, "I got 10 more people waiting for your job."
It's a very competitive business, of course. And I think we are entering this competitive business nowadays with many people losing job. And what would be your advice, how to tackle the challenge of boss that is rather unpleasant, and how do you learn from that and how do you behave?
I think right now that there are less unpleasant bosses around than there used to be. Given my role at the time, I think it was a very competitive industry. You know, you wanted to get on air as a young journalist. You learned as a producer, which is great. You learn on the news desk. At the time, we're pulling satellites out of the sky. We're putting programs together. But, you know, most of us really wanted to become journalists and we wanted to get on air. And we did, you know, but to do that, we absolutely knew that we couldn't walk away from, you know, any of the trials and tribulations that were thrown our way. And you know, in a way, I suppose it was like workplace abuse, bullying. I mean, even as a freelancer, when you started back in the day, they would literally just call you the freelancer. "Hey, you the freelancer? Can you do this?" You know, and you kind of go around, "Hello, my name is Eithne." So I always made a point when I did, you know, work, and I had worked at BBC, I'd worked at Sky News, Bloomberg, and CNBC, and I would always make a point of finding, you know, making the new person feel very welcome and the temporary person that came in and putting a name on them and even saying to other people, going, you know, "This is Maria. She's our freelancer tonight. Her name is Maria. The girl has a name." But I do think, you know, it depends on what profession you're in and what sector you're in. And every job is tough and you want to do well in there. But I really think that the relationship now between the employer and the employee has certainly shifted for much for the better. You know, there's so many programs going on in big companies whereby everybody has a right of reply. Everybody gets the opportunity to discuss what's happening. People are very much more involved in their career. And, you know, people really do, I think, have a lot more empathy for each other. So I don't think it's as bad at all as it used to be. It is not that dictatorial boss that says, "This is what you do, this is why you do it, and this is you do it because I say you do it." And I think when I grew up in my career, and that was definitely what was going on. That's not to say there were not some really great people out there. Without a doubt, there were always a few. And when I worked at BBC World, you know, there were some very encouraging people there. And it was probably one of my favorite places to work, indeed. But no,
I think it's actually, yeah. I think as a leader myself, I have to say that it gives me much more pleasure when I can empower others than just keep the power to myself. And I think it's actually the new model, which is you empower others and you gain more power by spreading it evenly. So now the question is, you talked about BBC, and a couple of years ago we heard about big news about the gender pay gap, and one of the outcomes was one of the research showed that actually the disparity mainly comes from very few female leaders working in the field, and that causes so many of us not really progressing in their careers. Did you experience that? And what would be your lessons how to become a leader in your field?
The gender pay gap at BBC, or indeed at anywhere else, and the BBC one particularly, that was led by Samira Ahmed, who's a friend of mine, and I worked with her at BBC, and I meet her occasionally in the summers. I mean, a fabulous woman, and a very, very brave woman to bring this forward. And before that, it was Carrie Gracie, who is the China correspondent at BBC, who also brought this. So, you know, they put their, not necessarily their careers on the line, but they put their personal life, I think, on the line too, because when you read a lot of what was going on, one saying, well, she wasn't as good as the guy presenter and all of this. I mean, it was tough, actually, what was going on and what people were talking about there. But there's certainly, I think, and particularly in something like television, I mean, it's personality driven. So when you look at like film stars, and celebrities, you know, what do you say if one gets X amount of money and the other one doesn't? And it's, you know, obviously in a place like the BBC, which is a state-funded organization, it shouldn't be as celebrity and personality driven. But it's not always going to be, you know, even in the sense that everybody comes in at this rate and everybody makes that money. But I think in most jobs which are not personality driven, there's a skill set, there's how you perform your job, there's a range of pay base for that job, and you should definitely, without a doubt, be getting the same as your male counterpart. I think that has changed a lot over the years. I certainly think some big companies have stepped up and said it has absolutely positively changed, and whoever they will employ, you know, they're going to pay the same rate. So that's not, it's becoming less of an issue. But the trouble is, of course, too, you know, there are less women, I think, going into the management fields. And, you know, I've never, I suppose we grew up as well not asking what people made. We didn't really talk about money. I suppose it just wasn't something, you wouldn't ask your colleague, how much are you getting paid? You know, it wasn't really something you did. And, but I do think it's evening out. It's getting less problematic. And also I think there's great awareness that people have that it's not being tolerated anymore. So sometimes you have to almost put a law in place, and you have to actually shout a bit louder and say, this will no longer be tolerated. And then things change.
Oh, absolutely. I think the key message is speak up, and because nothing will change. The mantra of activism is nothing changes if you don't do something about it. And also there is a great story of Cindy Gallop, who was working at BBH New York, and she actually spoke to her manager and pinned him down to the wall, as she explained, and she said, where am I going in this company? And you know, her boss did the usual trick, management trick of you tell me where you would like to go and we'll make it happen. So there is a way to actually make sure that your potential is not being wasted, as long as you show your dedication. So now, yeah, you wanted to add something?
I mean, again, I think, you know, we all have a duty to manage our own career as well as look at the expectation from companies. We have to be 100% responsible when we take that job. And our career and our destination is very, very much up to ourselves. And again, you know, I remember it was a young producer in America who, I think I was 4 years into a job, who came and literally had it planned out and said, in 2 years' time, if I don't get a promotion here, I move. In 2 years' time, if I don't get a promotion there, I move. And of course, in some industry, you can actually be very fluid and you can move. But he had set his 2 years on it, whereby I'm sitting around hoping that one day somebody would recognize my great talent and give me a better job. And it didn't necessarily happen. So had I had that, I think, empowerment much earlier when I was younger, I would probably have moved an awful lot quicker. but I didn't, because at the time, you know, I think it was, here we are, we've got a good job, you're expected to do this. So I probably wasn't as proactive as I should have been, even though I now look back and I do sort of have the golden resume of where have I worked. And when people talk to me about my media training and that, and say, well, how different are you than, you know, somebody down the road who has maybe worked at one channel or worked in, you know, the print media or something. I'm kind of going, I have ABC News, BBC, Sky News, Bloomberg, CNBC. I have the golden resume. So it's done me well.
Fantastic. But then we are talking about, we were talking in our previous editions of Positivity Hack Delivered about the double dilemma. A couple of years ago, 2014, Catalyst did a survey which showed that women just can't win as a leader, because we are either too strong or too weak. So how do you tackle that toxic consumption, that if you're too strong, you're too pushy, you're perceived as not really, you know, fitting the organization, because, well, let's call it, she's being called quite often a bitch.
It's very tough. And I think, unfortunately, you know, we're all part of the process. I mean, I think we sometimes forget where we've come from in a way. And we're within the process of a huge societal shift. We have to look back and we have to look at probably all sectors and all industries that were male dominated, and they were for so long. And that's just the way things were. We look back at, you know, gender roles within society, and they were dictated, and the woman's role was very much at home. And in terms of, I mean, I grew up in a family with 5 girls and 1 boy. And my father wasn't, if he'd been around a few more years, I think he might have been a bit more enlightened, but he had difficulty wondering why I wanted to go to a fancy university in Dublin and why I wanted to do something like politics and sociology and become a journalist. I mean, all of this, it didn't make sense. But we also have to put in place sort of his perspective at that time, having come from a very, very traditional country background, where expectations, where money wasn't, you know, in great supply, where ambition wasn't in great supply. So there was a side of him, I guess, that was protecting his daughters by not setting huge expectations for them, whereby I suppose I broke that mold for him. And it all worked out in the end, and I think he was very proud. But he, while it was happening, I don't think quite understood what I was doing and how I was going to deal with that and put up with it. But I think when you talk about, you know, we read so much about perceptions of global leaders, particularly when they're women. And I was just recently watching Julia Gillard from Australia and her address to the House and to the member of the opposition in terms of sexism. And we even look back with, you know, President Donald Trump in terms of what, you know, went on and what was even recorded and what was put out for the mass media to watch. You know, we recently saw Michael Bloomberg running for president and just the accusations brought against him. And these were, I think, men of a certain time. I'm not saying that they should be excused. And I think we've seen the case with Weinstein, with all of these. They got away with it, and they got away with, I think, you know, looking at women very, very differently. And I think the Me Too movement has really, really shifted that. And I think it's woken people up. I think it's not tolerated in the workplace anymore. It's certainly not tolerated in the workplace by so many CEOs. And I think contemporary, modern, well-run companies are very, very vocal about that. And it's something that they talk about and they really say will not be tolerated. So I think there's a shift, but we're coming out of huge societal change. And we're also just saying to everybody, this is a big change. You've got to be able to handle it, and you've got to be able to handle it better. And I do think, unfortunately, we're sort of in the middle of the tornado at the moment. When it moves out the other end, we're going to be looking at a much more even workforce, I believe. And you look at children right now, you look at some of the younger kids, and they have more male friends than I think I had growing up, you know, and they have friends from different countries and different races. And it's not as big an issue So I think that's, you know, evening out a little bit, and I'm quite optimistic that this will get better in the future as we go through it. And unfortunately, I think we've been going through it for maybe a little bit too long. But it's tough for the women and the leaders here who I think have to actually, they don't have to put up with it, and they're not putting up with it. But sadly, it's often happening in the background and in the sidelines still, and that's unacceptable.
I think you touched upon a very interesting topic, because it shows that the research, that there was another research that showed that once there is a diverse leadership, so, and I mean diversity in totality of age, ethnicity, gender, that showed that actually there was much less instances of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment doesn't happen when you've got different people at the management level. So that's actually a very interesting topic, and the discussion is great, even though sometimes what we hear, you know, through politicians' mouth is not the best thing you could hear. But on the other hand, I think community validates what politicians are saying, and they are the ones who are checking and say, well, that wasn't on, right?
I do think we're going to see great change, and I think we are seeing great change among progressive companies, particularly at a leadership position. We are also, when you look at, you know, politicians around the world, we have, you know, quite a few female presidents and prime ministers, more than we've had before. We have a lot more women in cabinet. Fine, we don't have enough, but it is happening. We don't have enough women leaders, without a doubt, in corporations, but I love to see the fact that you really, you know, hear from very sincere CEOs that they are, it's part of what they want to do, and they feel very comfortable with that, and they want to make sure that they will change the diverse mix of their companies. So it's encouraging to hear that.
So do you remember an interview you took with some female role model that really you remember so well and you would like to talk about, or maybe somebody could check her profile?
I think, you know, over the years, I've interviewed probably more men than women. I mean, I'll be honest with you, my background has been predominantly business news, and a lot of my focus is very much in the energy sector. And unfortunately, it tends to, I work a lot with the OPEC ministers, and they are all men, whether we like it or not, every one of them. We did have one female minister once from Nigeria, a very interesting woman. And I think also within the industry, there's, you know, a very interesting woman who heads up the Occidental Petroleum, Vicky Hollop, and the first CEO of a major international oil company. And even Vicky said, you know, that when she took on her leadership role, and she comes from, you know, a tremendous wealth of engineering background. I mean, her technology knowledge, her engineering knowledge is second to none. And she even said how she noticed when she moved to a leadership position, how very little attention anybody paid to that. The fact she knew it, they were very happy that she had it. But she said then a lot of it came, there was more focus on what she talked about and what she said and what she was doing, rather than, you know, the great background that she had. But then, of course, I think that's what happens. And the market analyzes what leaders are doing, how they look, how they answer questions. You know, they're all looking at how the stock price is moving, how they're delivering company results, all of that. But I do see some tremendous women, you know, coming into leadership roles within the oil and gas sector. And it is without a doubt a predominantly male-oriented industry. But then you look at actual, you know, industries like women's fashion, and it has been predominantly male-oriented for a long time. You know, so I think every industry has been led by men, and I think we sometimes forget that we're part of the process of the change. And this is, it's a societal change, it's a huge change in the world, and it's never been done before. So,
which reminds me of Melinda Gates, who was talking about when she would enter the office and she would start talking about the product. Everybody was looking at her like, who are you? What are you doing here? And then she started about the product that she knew inside out, and then it transpired that she knows what she's talking about. then she would gain this respect. But the first kind of biased view is, well, she's a secretary, maybe I'll ask her for a coffee.
I don't know. I mean, that has happened. I mean, I've been asked at a conference. I mean, I've been asked by the kind of assistant to a major CEO or something, who kind of came in and just said, my CEO's coming, we need to do that. And I'm, don't have time to get engaged with somebody who's been a bit hyper and nervous that their CEO is coming, and I know he's on the panel and all of that. And I think I had met him before, so he knew who I was. And he said, can you go and get some coffee? And I'm like, absolutely, sure. And then I came back in, I had coffee, I had water, and the CEO was like, oh, Eithne, great to see you again, thank you. And the guy looks and he goes, oh, you're Eithne, you're the moderator? I'm like, yeah, but I go, I make a mean cup of coffee as well. So it's like, please, relax. So I never take it as offense, because I think, sometimes, because the minute you then handle it with such grace in one way, they'll always remember that. And they'll never think about it again, And quite honestly, I always say to young girls when they come into work, I remember at BBC, even at Bloomberg, anywhere else, we had a young intern or a young assistant who came once, and she announced she was not getting the coffee. And I mean, these are pressured places to work. Whoever's available to get coffee should just get it, because everybody is going to say thank you so much. It's going to be the best thing you've done when there's deadlines to hit. And quite honestly, early on, when I was a young, I was an assistant on the desk. I was probably, just about qualified to make coffee. I had just come out of university, and I got my first job with ABC News in America. I mean, this was a big deal. This was with the network. And they had a huge breaking story one weekend, and everybody was in place. The US or the New York people came in to Chicago. It was such a big story. There was so much going on. And I really wasn't able to do anything. I was there for maybe a week. I didn't know how to do stuff. And I remember looking around once, and all of these big hotshots from New York were there, and the place was absolutely frantic. And, that was the days the wire services were been literally typed out on the wire. I managed to rip the wire and bring it around a bit. I could do that. But I knew myself there wasn't much I could do. And I remember thinking, I'm just going to make some coffee. And I just brought it around to people, which people were just so gracious and going, oh my God, thank you so much. And I also walked into the big boss's office with some, to which he was just so grateful. But he also turned around and he said, you're that new girl who joined us this week, aren't you? And I'm like, yes, I'm at the. And he goes, apart from going, thank you so much, he's going, we're really stuck this weekend and we really need and he's like, could you work extra over the weekend and that? And I'll never forget that gesture of me. So first of all, I managed to get into his office without knocking on the door because I had a gift. But it got me in the room, and it also, got me in a conversation with somebody. So sometimes I would say make the coffee. You never know where it gets you. I know it's very simple, but they didn't take me after that.
Yeah. You were definitely remembered after that. So we are coming to the end of our lovely conversation. Time flies with you, Eithne, and you're definitely a woman of many, many words and great knowledge. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, before we convene, I wanted to ask you, let's imagine the lockdown is over and tomorrow you can have a private breakfast with anybody in the world. Who would you like to have that breakfast and where?
Let's do where first. I would do it at the Ritz in London. And I'll do it there because one summer when I was about maybe 17 and I hadn't done great at school on my first exams, and I had to go back and redo my exams before I went to university. But I worked there as a roommate. So I didn't have much knowledge at the time. I didn't have, great aspirations. I didn't know what I was going to do. My exams were bad. I didn't have much money, but I always knew. And I think it was almost thanks to working there a bit that I thought I could stay here someday. And this is really what it could be. And it's so funny. I'll never forget that, it kind of, I think, gave me a feel for this something so much better. So again, by being in that environment, it was like, I'm going to come back here, and this is going to be my standard. I can do this. So that would be my place to go there. And anytime I meet hotel people and tell them that story, that I literally, worked as a roommate in a hotel, they were like, no way. And I'm like, yeah, I can turn a corner on a bed really, really good. So I can stay.
And make a coffee.
And make the coffee. And who would I want to have breakfast with? Let me tell you who I'd love to have breakfast with. And I've had the opportunity to meet him on 1 or 2 occasions. And it is the recently appointed chief executive of BP, the international oil company BP. And his name is Bernard Looney. He happens to be Irish, but that's not the main reason. But the reason I'd love to spend a little bit of, private time and really good, close conversation with him is because he really sincerely believes that, and I think he's going to be a very different leader in the oil and gas sector. And top of his agenda is to make sure that he is running a much more diverse company. Part of his agenda is, that he's running a much more relevant company. And it's an oil and gas company, but they've done some huge investment into the renewable space. When we look at an energy company that is actually within an energy transition, for him and for his shareholders and for the people who work there, he really wants this to be more relevant. But he has personally stepped up and said very publicly that he's going to change this company. And he really does mean it when you listen to him speak. And I know not too long ago, somebody had asked him about being on a panel. And what I heard back was that he actually said to them that, while he'd be happy to do it, he certainly would not appear on an all-male panel. So even at that level, whereby he's saying that this all has to change and this industry has to change and this industry has to become more diverse. So for the CEO to take the lead and to publicly take such a big lead, I think this is going to change the industry. And I think a lot of people will step up and listen to him, listen to what he has to say, and, hopefully follow his example.
Fantastic. And let's finish on this positive news. And I hope many other leaders will follow his example. Eithne, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing. As you can see, many thanks pouring in, and we are going to link your specific videos later on. And if you would like to reach Eithne for advice, she's available on LinkedIn, and her website is, Eithne, could you remind us?
Yes, it's eithtrainor.com, but the spelling is rather odd. I have an Irish first name that is pronounced with an A at the end, even though it's Eithne. Sorry about that, guys. And Treanor is my family name. Yeah, I mean, this is my business, but my LinkedIn profile is under Eithne Treanor. And there's a few fun videos up there at the moment, so I'll be adding to that. And so it's Eithtrainor.
They are fantastic.
Yeah.
www. We'll post the link as well after the show. Thank you so much, Eithne. Have a lovely day and hug the future.
Okay, good night from Dubai for you, and we'll keep in touch. It's been real fun. Great to have been here with you and share this time.
Great to have you. Bye.